All right, in this video we are going to talk about the scope of a variable. So before we get started, I want to show you an example. This is just the void methods example. I just took all the comments out, so it's a little bit shorter, and just to show you the issue that people run into with scope. Okay, so they'll be programming and they'll see a variable like this, double avar. Okay, and they will say, hey, well, I need to use that in some other method down here. And so what they'll do is try to use that variable like this. Let's say I just want to print it out, and then they compile and they get this message right here, and that message says error, cannot find symbol on line 24, and it's pointing towards avar. So when you have error, cannot find symbol, it means that Java is looking for something called avar, a variable or a method or a class name, something like that, and it cannot find that method name. So, the first time when this happens to you, your reaction is, what do you mean you can't find that? It's right here on line 15. You can't see that? Right? You know that you have to declare a variable before you use it, and so you're like, yeah, it's right here. There's the declaration. So what do you mean you can't see it? It's literally like 9 lines up right here. So that's an issue, and that has to do with what's called the scope of a variable. Okay, so the scope of a variable is the location in the program where the variable is accessible, and that's what's going on in this example. In this example, I'm trying to use this variable right here on line 15, but for whatever reason, I cannot use that variable on line 15. Okay, I'm on line 24 down here. So line 24 is not a location where that can be used, right? If I comment this out, right, then I have no problems, and see here I'm using the variable avar with no problem. So 17 is a place, line 17 is a place in the program where you can use the variable avar, but obviously not on line 24 because that causes a problem. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So every variable that you have has an associated scope with it. Okay, and so to me, Java is pretty straightforward in the method in which you determine what the scope of a variable is. It has to do with a block of code. Okay, so a block of code is the code contained between a set of curly braces. So if I go look back here, wherever that matching curly brace is, that's a block. So I've got a block of code here, I've got a block of code here, I've got a block of code starting on line 4, right, and going to 20. I've got a block of code here on line from line 2 to line 38. Got a block of code, 4 to 20. We already talked about that one. Okay, so that's what a block of code is. All right, and so to determine the scope of a variable, the scope of a variable is the block in which it is declared. That's not completely accurate, right? Because you can't use a variable before it's declared, right? You have to declare it, so it's really from the declaration, right, to the end of the block. But it's good enough. Okay, just think about it in that way. So the issue is you can only use a variable inside the block in which you declare. So now we can see the issue with this, right? The issue is that I can only use the variable avar in the block in which it's declared. So if I find its declaration, right, it's right here. How can you tell it's the declaration? Well, that's what declarations look like. They look like a type, right, and then the variable name, right, and a semicolon at the very least. So right here is where it's declared. It's not declared here because there's no type right in front of the name. All right, so the declaration for the variable avar is on line 15. So if you work your way backwards, right, through the code until you find the first open curly brace that you encounter going backwards, and that is on line 4. Okay, so that means that you can use the variable in this block after you declare it. Okay, so from line 4 to line 20, really it's from line 15 to line 20. But the way I ask these questions on the test, I just ask for the block. Okay. All right. So you can see that the scope ends at 20. That's what's causing the problem right here. All right. And so that's how you determine the scope of a variable. So that fixes that problem. If I have a parameter like this one, right, that's where it's declared. Okay. So the variable num, I can use it in this block right here, in the method body, okay, if you have a parameter. All right, so just in case you don't believe me, right, you can see when I first learned this about Java, I said, well, if that's the case, right, if it really is true that the block determines the scope, right, the block in which it's declared, what would happen if I put parentheses or curly braces, right, around this line? Okay, that would change the scope of this variable double, right? Because now it's declared in this block, so I would only be able to use it from lines 14 to line 16, and that would cause a problem in line 17, if that's really true, if it's really that cut and dry. And you can see, right, it is, because right now you can see that the scope is from line 17, okay? It says, hey, there's a problem. Avar, Java's going, hey, I never heard of this, man. I have no clue what you're talking about. No clue at all about Avar. Never heard it. You never told me about it. And you're going, hey, no, it's right here. I told you about it just like 2 lines ago. What do you mean you never heard of it? It's right here. All right, so that's because these curly braces, right, affect the scope. So that seems weird, but I actually like it a lot because it makes it easy, or I shouldn't say easy, but like not as complicated to determine the scope as some other languages I've seen. Okay, so it's important that you realize about scope. Otherwise, you know, you'll be in situations like we talked about at the very beginning of this video. All right, I have some practice problems in the homework problems. Make sure you take a look at those, because that's how these kind of problems will appear on the exam coming up. We have some other problems in there as well about tracing through the functions in there. And so but the scope problem basically kind of looks like this. I'll have some line numbers, and then I'll ask you to determine the scope of a variable. So that's how they will look. All those answers are written in terms of the block in here. So make sure you practice those before the test. All right, that's it for this one.